Okay, we're live here. So, hello, audience. I am Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. Paul?
I'm Paul Spears, also with Oasis.
And I'm Lance Finney, also with Oasis.
Okay, so I don't know how many are watching here live, but you know that our big topic for today, we're going to talk about all the different ways and why you could wire up your wire up your RxJS observable streams to an Angular component. But we try to talk about some minor topics, lesser topics first, to sort of get warmed up and give people a chance to make it in. So our first warm-up topic is the, I guess, software community financial news of the day, of rumors of Microsoft possibly acquiring Discord. And that caught my attention because I'm sort of a casual, occasional Discord user. But I think Paul here is an expert, frequent Discord user. I don't know what to think about this, Paul. What should I think about it?
It's hard to say. Right now, it's like Discord's looking to sell. Microsoft's thinking about buying. Maybe they buy them, maybe they don't. If they do, that may not be the end of the world. But if you kind of look back at history, there's memes everywhere right now about this potential acquisition. And one of them was showing like it's that Grim Reaper meme where it goes door to door. And it showed, Microsoft Messenger during, in the first door, and it had Skype in the second. And then Death with his, scythe was about to walk into the Discord room to finish it off. And I think that's everyone's initial knee-jerk reaction. And I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned, but it's hard to know what direction they might take it. They might just buy it, continue to let Discord run it, and just collect a paycheck off of ad revenue for all we know. It's really hard to know what direction they'd go. But yeah, I'm a little concerned, especially as we were beginning to take a look at, hey, is there room for this as kind of like our own internal chat tool as an organization? The potential to use this to connect people outside of the gaming community is really nice. So maybe this is a benefit. Maybe Microsoft will bring the needed sensibilities that could make it usable in more than just the gaming arena, to the platform.
Like, the thing I've thought about Discord for several years now is that they should fork their own code base and then rebrand the fork Corporate Harmony or Enterprise Harmony or something, and take basically the same feature set, graphed on single sign-on, and sell it as a corporate solution, because it just works so well at scale compared to other chat tools. And I kind of wonder, what would lead Discord to, possibly be acquired by an enterprise-y play. I mean, this seems like they could launch their own enterprise-y play and be a strong competitor on day 3 of their launch. They could be Microsoft's direct competitor. So I'm curious what would lead them to sell rather than jumping in. I guess, I don't know anyone there, so I haven't the faintest idea, but
I don't know. I mean, the enterprise teams the ones I've encountered have always seemed very, very skeptical of any ideas or technologies that come out of the space of gaming. There's almost this fear that it will somehow pollute, the culture or the workforce itself. If you use Discord, suddenly you'll start gaming during the day.
They couldn't call it Discord, right? They'd have to call it something else and change it to a light theme with some kind of more corporate looking features. But it just, the underlying feature set seems so strong that if they could somehow get past the association with gaming, it could be so much more valuable to a whole market. But I don't know. Lance, have you Discorded?
I use some blogs that happen to have Discord as their way of commenting, but I'm not a big gamer, so it's not an important part of my life. But I did just post a link to a list of Microsoft acquisitions. As we were talking, I Wikipedia'd it, and it's a long list. There's a lot there. Now, and most of these are companies I've never heard of or didn't know if I ever heard of. But the ones that are on here that this conversation kind of reminds me of are Skype
Mhm.
and LinkedIn and GitHub. And
those are doing great. I mean, not Skypes. The old
Yeah.
Skype is gone, kind of replaced with the new Skype, but the other two are really thriving.
Yeah,
at least
like
numerically.
the Microsoft of the 90s would have had a much heavier hand with LinkedIn and GitHub than I have noticed. Like, I use GitHub regularly,
probably.
and I have to remind myself that it's owned by Microsoft these days. Perhaps other people use it in such a way that it's obvious to them, but they seem to have a light touch so far, or at least with some of the recent acquisitions. So who knows where it'll go.
I mean, the only way I've been negatively affected by the Microsoft acquisitions is that I now have more Microsoft. I have too many Microsoft accounts. I don't know what they all are. There's no way to find them, and there's no way to consolidate them. And it really is like there have been tools that I'd like to use that I've literally given up using because I can't figure out a working Microsoft account, and I can't create a new one. I've been using computers and account systems for a really long time, and if I can't figure out how to get into a Microsoft account that it insists I have to think I'm not the only. I've got, it's probably more than 1% of the customer base that just can't even get in. So, I mean, hopefully that's just like a temporary problem as they're working on integrating their acquisitions. But that's really the only difficulty I've encountered. Is a few times I've just been simply unable to use a product because I can't figure out a working account.
Yeah. What that reminds me of is when I was fresh out of college, my primary email address was a Hotmail account, which is now just, it collects spam. I don't do much with it. But when my kids were born, I decided I wanted to create an account for them. And for whatever reason, we were doing something that required Microsoft. So when my 14-year-old needed that, I went to create a Hotmail account, and I was able to create one. And then 2 years later, when my 12-year-old needed one, I couldn't do that. And now it's an Outlook. So one of my kids has a Hotmail account and one of my kids has an Outlook account, and both of them use their Google accounts through their school because they don't care about it at all. So it's just, there is some confusion there in the market with that.
So raise your hand if you bought your kids obvious domain names when they were small.
Yeah.
Okay.
I expired, but yes.
Oh, boo. Okay, well, it seems like we've kind of beat the Discord dead horse. So our other sort of before the big topic was, what do we think about when we'll start seeing in-person events again? I mean, as for me, I'm feeling very optimistic, vaccinated, waiting for the time to take effect. I see a whole lot of people on my Facebook and my Twitter that are at least partway through vaccination. That I see a lot of like kind of experts with kind of somewhat justified short term, and by short term I mean like the next couple months worry. I haven't really seen any credible or widespread credible suggestions that in the US we will still be very worried about pandemics 4 months from now or 6 months from now. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic about like this fall there being some in-person events. What are you guys seeing? How are you feeling about it?
I really don't know how it's going to be. My family has been very much on the cautious end of the spectrum. I've been working in this room in my house for a year now. My wife has been working in a different room in this house. So we're really comfortable with not interacting with people. And so I think I might be on the slow end for adopting it. But I also I kind of miss jumping on airplanes and going to a different part of the country and eating at different restaurants and meeting people and stuff.
Lance, you had me going there. I thought for a minute you said you were enjoying being isolated from your wife by being in different rooms.
Yeah, not quite.
That's where I thought you were headed. I wonder if there'll be some like survey that shows like people's marital happiness over the course of a pandemic is directly proportional to whether they have separate work-at-home workspaces or whether they're forced into the same one.
Yeah,
I kind of wonder if there might be some research going on.
Yeah, a year ago when all of this happened, I talked to a high school friend of mine who lives in Brooklyn, and her family is about the same size as mine, same age of kids, and they had like an 800 square foot apartment in Brooklyn, and we have a house with 4 bedrooms. Like, just by living in the suburbs of St. Louis instead of living in Brooklyn, it's been a good place to be in life. Yeah,
but St. Louis suburbs has been a good place to be through this
Yeah.
Period.
But back to the original question, I look forward to it. The NGRX Conf has been postponed several times. Their website now says summer, but I don't know if they're going to announce anything. I think some of the other Angular conferences we typically look at, like NGConf is coming up within the next month, but last year they did a fall one. Maybe Frosty will try to do an in-person fall one. I don't know.
So my theory is that big events are going to have a hard time getting organized to do something too soon, because to put on a big event, you have to make a huge financial commitment to a venue, and you have to make that commitment far enough ahead, and you have to be 100% sure that you will get your money back, or else you lose all the money. I mean, it's really tough.
The logistics of it might be impossible today, because to start planning for a fall event, you need to be planning that now. And all the venues are going to be playing by the rules of what it looks like today, which would make it impossible, right, to actually do a big event. And so I think there will be a logistical challenge of, even if we're already in the fall, like there will be such a delay, a lag of when it's possible to have planned for it, that we'll all be ready, and I think we'll all be dressed up with no place to go come this fall.
I mean, so I got this idea. It's just an idea at this point, so there's no breaking news, but we could do a mini event in our workspace.
That's true.
Sure. It's our space. We don't need to pay off a venue. We already have a venue. What we can accommodate? How many can we accommodate? A lot, right? We could. Yeah. I think we could have 50 people hang out for a day or two. I don't know. Maybe we'll invite all of our Angular friends to come out for a couple days or something.
NG flyover.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also going to be interesting, because just what our society will expect and what the expectations are of seeing people grouping together. Because, 4 months ago, let's say, definitely the idea of having something where 50 people were going to be in one room, some people would jump at it, but there'd be a lot of our society that would be very judgmental. And now it's changing. But when's the line going to happen? When is that going to flip over? And I don't think anyone knows, and I don't think anyone really wants to be the people to find out that they went too early.
I mean, yeah, there are definitely logistical challenges, right? You would not want to accidentally invite a substantial population of vaccine deniers into your in-person event and have something bad happen and get blamed for it. But I mean, I have to imagine that among software developers, most will choose to be vaccinated, and that will not be a problem. And people will be able to have events. Nothing bad will happen. It'll be fine.
Yeah,
that's my thought.
Yeah, and then will events require vaccinations, or at least say they require vaccinations?
Yeah, I don't know.
Who knows?
And I think that's a problem we can probably dodge working in fields where it's not likely to be a big problem. But there will be other kinds of events that have to solve problems that we don't. So, yeah. I don't know, Paul, how optimistic are you about this fall? There being at least people who can pull off a venue, having some in-person events.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable. Right now, you mentioned the use of R space. Like, I don't see any reason with the trajectory of where things are today that we can't be looking at meetups at least come this fall.
Yeah,
they require such a short planning window to execute on that seems like a reasonable thing to expect come this fall.
Yeah, that'd be great. Although I miss going places. Like I barely even like people at all. I don't miss people as much as I miss like going to where there are people, if that makes any sense. Oh, well, okay. Well, I guess we're 14 minutes in. We should go on to our main topic. So our main topic of the day is all the different ways and why of connecting RxJS data, so data you pulled via anything that gives you an observable, onto your component. So I think in the announcement, in fact, here I'll just read it off the published description on the YouTube channel here. The ways I listed were just subscribe just subscribe in the component TS. Use the async pipe as a second. Do an async-await to promisify your observable, and then you have data, which you then bind onto the screen. So those are sort of the three kind of most immediately obvious. Then the next one was a route resolver. And then I had a maybe more, because there are some other more arcane ways to do it that I didn't want to dig into in a little description that I was publishing. So I don't know, should we kind of talk through how each of those work and their trade-offs before we get into the kind of broader issues? Or I don't know, somebody want to pick one of those? Or who wants to give a little rundown of subscribe and why you should and shouldn't?
You're muted, Lance.
Say again?
Sorry, I was muted. I'd forgotten. My cat had been talking a little bit earlier, so I muted for her, and I forgot that I'd done that. Subscribe is kind of the first one you learn about. Subscribe is the one that's really in the box for observables. And so I think everyone who first looks at this stuff will start with subscribe. And it has its quirks, especially if you're going to take into account needing to unsubscribe your manual subscriptions. And that is where things get a little bit interesting. But it is... the API is probably the most obvious, and it's the simplest. You can subscribe, and in the callback function for the subscribe function, you can grab the values out and put it into any local thing you want, and then make it available for your template, just like anything else that you would put in your template. It's really easy, really straightforward, but it's not what I would use first. It's what I learned first, but it's not what I would use now unless I have a really good reason to. So and maybe Paul can explain what those reasons are with the async pipe.
Well, so I'm going to talk about subscribe a little more.
Okay.
So I don't think it would be helpful because, I think we have a relatively advanced audience. So I don't think it would be helpful to go over all the exact mechanics, but I think we should acknowledge there are like 4 or 5 different reasonably popular patterns for how to like make sure you unsubscribe in a somewhat concise way. Right? Yeah. You can make a separate variable for each subscription, but that's like the lowbrow way to do it. You could take advantage of a subscription being able to have more than one subscription. Like basically the subscription abstraction in RxJS actually can manage more than one subscription. Mm-hmm. So you can just keep adding them all, then you unsubscribe them all with one line. You can make an array of subscriptions. So then you just push each subscription onto your array. Then in your onDestroy, you do a for each on that array to unsubscribe each one. So those are the ways that most immediately come to mind. But I think with all of those, you're talking about, how concise can we do this thing? How concisely can we make sure that we manually take responsibility for unsubscribing? Because there's a sort of cardinal rule, right? If you wrote the subscribe, like you probably have to write the unsubscribe.
Well, and there are other approaches as well. So a couple that come to mind are with operators. If you only want one value, you can do a take one, and that will automatically unsubscribe for you.
You can do take until, right?
Yeah, and that's what I usually use when I have to use a manual subscribe. It's more complicated though, because then you have to create this other subject and have its life cycle managed by the ng on destroy.
Yeah. And
so you have to know quite a few different concepts to get it right. Once I've done it once, it's kind of copy and paste from component to component, but it's not that hard. I have seen other things that people have done, like creating a decorator that will then decorate this component so that anything that is unsubscribable will unsubscribe when it's done. Unfortunately, I've seen that misused. I joined a project a couple years ago, and they had used that in a couple of their components, but they didn't realize, they didn't look at how it was implemented, that it actually required you to keep a reference to each of the subscriptions in it, so that
then it can walk the references and So have you seen the base class version where you make a base class, and in the base class you make a destroy subject, and then that way in the descendant classes you can take until the destroy subject? I've seen that one.
Yeah, I haven't seen any that really do feel like they take away all of the boilerplate, because there's still things that you have to do to get it right. Like in the example that I did, the guy thought that he could just subscribe to something and it would be captured, but because he didn't keep the reference, it was never captured, and it wasn't doing any good. And so none of those really have hit the mark for me, at least.
And those that work with us at Oasis Digital know that on Friday afternoons we do our internal developer session where some complaining may occur. We try to limit our complaining to a portion of once a week, but I will do a modest amount of complaining here in our public forum that like we're on Angular 11. Is that right? Has 12 isn't 12
11.
in pre-alpha or something? I really think by now Angular should do something better in the box to help us with this. I don't think in major version 11 we should have to look to the third party for the tools for this. So, you know, either the destroy subject should be in the box or the decorator should be like there should be, I feel like there really should have been something in the box for this by now. And I'm sure there's reasons why there's not, but I still wish there was. Paul, what you have thoughts?
Well, I don't feel I don't agree with that because, well, so let me walk back. So everyone here so far has been talking about like ways to handle what happens when you subscribe, and I don't really do any of those.
You're saying that the answer in the box is to stop doing that.
Kind of, and so I'm not even talking about async pipe yet. Like what I'm talking about is if you find yourself subscribing to like multiple observables at the same time, like within a component, regardless of like, again, I'm not talking async pipe versus, you know, subscribe versus other techniques. If you're doing that kind of thing where you are pulling together multiple sources of asynchronous data into a single location in a component, that component is probably doing too much. And so like the need for an advanced technique to keep track of multiple subscriptions, in my opinion, is a code smell by definition.
That is a great point. I have a wrinkle on that though. If you're having to pull in multiple sources of asynchronous data and it is an essential need of your component, maybe it's telling you that you should be combining those and subscribing to the end result, not subscribing to 4 separate things and then using an array of subscriptions to unsubscribe them all. So I think
even if you do that, chances are that logic should still be in a service.
Yeah, right. Maybe you should be writing a non-graphical layer, a more testable non-graphical layer to your app that gathers up the right set of data for this well-scoped component, and then there is no complex multi-unsubscribing because it goes away.
And so my pushback to your comment of there being something in the box is I believe that if they had added that to the box, we'd see that as an excuse to abuse a bad practice. But on the flip side,
I think you're right on this one. I think I'm actually wrong to want it in the box. No, you've sold me. I will stop wanting it in the box.
Don't do that yet, because the reason why I'm hedging here is because, like, on the flip side, people are still doing it anyway. Even without the pattern in place to help people do it easier, there are very few times where I walk into a consulting or teaching engagement and find that people have had this realization yet, or have understood this additional nuance to like this RxJS architectural pattern. So it would be nice.
We can help.
It would be nice if there was a pattern. That way, if they were going to do this, that it would help them solve some of the problems it causes automatically. So it'd be nice if it were there to help those folks, but at the same time, not having it there will help some other subset of people like find a better way architecturally.
So it seems like we all agree anyway that the general answer is you shouldn't be doing a manual subscribe in a component often enough that it causes you a lot of irritation and a lot of inconvenience. You should kind of only be doing it occasionally when there's some kind of special case, and then it's maybe not such a big deal to deal with it. Is that kind of the consensus?
Yeah, for me, it's if I'm getting data from an observable onto the screen, then yay, I don't have to manually subscribe. If I'm going in the other direction, perhaps if I'm using reactive forms and I want to get information from that and I need to get something out of value changes or something in order to send somewhere else that's not directly on the screen, that might be where I'm subscribing. But if my goal is getting it onto the screen, yeah, don't use subscribe.
I once abused NGRX actions, I guess. What are they called? No, NGRX effects when I needed to subscribe to something that wasn't exactly NGRX related in a declarative way. Okay, Paul's thinking about what I'm saying. You madman. Okay. So do we have any more to say on the manual subscribe before we go to the async pipe?
The one other thing I would say with manual subscribe is if you, so we've already said, I've already said at least, I try not to subscribe. But if you find yourself subscribing within a subscribe, you're doing nested subscriptions, you need to spend some time learning about higher order operators like switch map, merge map, exhaust map, concat map. Start with switch map, just start with one of those, figure that out. And once you understand that, then learn the others in comparison to it. But subscribing within a subscribe is a huge code smell.
Yeah, I agree.
I would also say that, like we talked about, like the challenges of unsubscribing properly, but to me that isn't even the reason why we should be avoiding subscribe in the first place. Like everyone likes to use plumbing analogies to describe and talk about RxJS, and what I often see folks doing is they will have one or more observables, or maybe a subject and an observable. And they'll subscribe to one, take the data out of that, and then form a new observable and subscribe to that.
Terrible anti-pattern, right?
Yeah. At times
really
that
bad.
can look like what Lance said with like a subscribe and a subscribe. And that's a different problem. Right here, I'm just talking about like the simple case of I have a form control and I want to reactively respond to a user typing in an ID into that form control. And then I want to use that value to then go make an HTTP call to get some sort of like, I don't know, employee details or user details.
To do some validation on the screen or something, ambient data display. Yep.
Right. Or just fetch a list. I mean, it's could be a good old fashioned search. And with that process, what I see a lot of folks do is they'll subscribe to that form control value change, then make an HTTP call within the subscribe, and then they'll either save that as a variable, which they will later subscribe to, or they will subscribe within the subscribe. And or an alternative is that they subscribe to that value and then they go put it into the next value of some sort of subject.
Yeah.
To then go make their HTTP call. That way they
pattern, right?
Yeah. But they've cheated out of Lance's code smell by doing that. And realize that that's all you've done is you've cheated out of the code smell.
Yeah.
That Lance
it's still a code
described.
smell. Yeah.
Right. And the reason why this is so bad is because if we go back to the analogy of plumbing, that RxJS idea that, hey, these are pipes, the observables themselves are the actual plumbing fixtures and the junctions and the outlets and the knobs that control the flow of water. And the water is the data that goes through your pipelines. If we go back to that analogy, then when we think about what we're doing, we subscribe and we put it in another one. That's like saying, okay, I've got some plumbing in my house, and I'm going to saw a hole in the middle of my pipe, and I'm going to have a bucket there, and I have a manual process where as that bucket fills, I take it, I put it over to this other faucet, this other drain, and I dump it down there. Like, clearly that is madness. Yeah. Like if your goal is to get your water from this input line and then have it, come out this other part of your house, the answer is to make a pipe that connects all the way from one to the other. Use whatever kinds of junctions and plumbing fittings you need to make that happen. Like that's just, you look at that and when you visualize it, it's common sense for the plumbing analogy. Observables, it's harder to make that connection, but that's what we're talking about here. Like learn the observables and the RxJS patterns enough to be able to make that kind of practice and pattern the same. That way you don't have a chance to spill the bucket of data on its way to its destination.
So I actually have a personal goal of never subscribe. And I think that should be a default lint rule in all Angular application code. And only certain library code has any business doing subscribes. It's too low level of an abstraction to use at the application level. I have been always able to achieve this if I try, but I've also spent a lot of time working with RxJS, and there are many projects where people are being very productive and haven't spent a lot of time with RxJS. And if people can get the job done and the feature works well enough with the subscribe, I'm not too judgmental about it. But I personally try to avoid ever subscribing at all.
Yeah. Now,
For the
we've got some patterns we'll show later. I happen
Yeah,
to bring some old school notes with me that I took about this subject. We'll show some patterns later where I think subscribe is still justifiable.
So what
But
do we
yeah,
do
I think
instead?
You said subject. Ha ha. Oh wait.
Okay, I'm putting the words up on the screen. What do we do instead of subscribing 99% of the time?
Yeah, async pipe is obviously the go-to.
Yeah. And don't we actually teach this like quite early? When we teach Angular Bootcamp, I think we actually take people down the path of async pipe as the primary way to get this data. Not as like it's not an advanced tool to use maybe later. It's like the primary tool that you use always.
Yeah, it's definitely for some of each instructor has their own style, and some instructors will literally teach it like within the same thrust of the conversation as they introduce observables, and just kind of start with that as the starting point of observable use within Angular.
So we had a viewer suggest a presentation that's on YouTube somewhere, and the way YouTube works, viewers cannot paste URLs in, which is super annoying. But Lance went and found it, and actually got the actual link up. So captured in the chat of this YouTube stream, Lance managed to get the link to that presentation, which is pretty good. Although then the viewer said that's actually not the one, but it's a good one also. So okay. So Paul, so depending on how a given class goes, people might learn the async pipe like within 15 minutes of when they learn to subscribe by hand, one way or the other.
Right. Even those that aren't teaching it like at the same moment, you're going to hear it within the hour.
Right. So it's
yeah.
So we intentionally present it up front as this is the way. And I get the impression there's a lot of other kind of different guidance out there from other Angular experts in the community that think of it as an advanced topic to be talked about later. And so I think that's a pretty big difference between kind of our collective take on it versus the community at large, of whether it's front and center versus something for later.
Yeah, and I think that stems from a couple of different things. I know that oftentimes people kind of give us funny looks because we will intentionally present something that is actually contrarian to kind of either best practices or common ideas that you see that are promoted by the community. And way early on, the ideas of dealing with observables with async pipe was one of those where a lot of folks didn't really think that was a good default. And what we've learned over time is that our recommendation for our classes and for many of our consultant engagements are based on the fact that we are working with application developers, which have a different set of tools in the toolbox than, say, the library authors or the framework builders or even those that are doing instructional work. The tool is a different kind of tool. And if you're doing library work, we can actually see later on how if you're deep in the middle of a library, odds are you're the one consuming an observable to then go on to transform that data in some other way. And there is no visual outlet for you to attach an async pipe to.
Yeah, I want to bring up a comment from a viewer I think is relevant to what you're saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so in those situations, with those different contexts applied, like async pipe just simply becomes a non-entity.
So I want to push back on that slightly, actually, because I heard what you were saying. I saw this comment. Most of the time, I think most of the time, you actually do end up with something that eventually lands on the screen. And therefore, most of the time, you can ultimately use an async pipe. So for example, like let's say you have to like fetch to get a user profile, right? So you might have something that flows through, then it goes to a pipe, it switch maps to get the user profile. Well, you may tap into that to send off some side effect to elsewhere in your system. But there's a pretty good chance that part of that user profile fetch ends up with some piece of data that lands on the screen somewhere. So I have very often found that even if I need to do some sort of internal processing, if there's even one piece of the processing that lands on the screen, often that one piece is enough to make it where I no longer have to write a subscribe.
Even if that piece of processing is the results of making a call to the back end
Yep.
to send that data, and then
Right.
the results of that call, you can actually
Right.
represent that as a singular pipeline.
You don't terminate and then resubscribe and make, no, you like, just like you were saying, Paul, in depth, you connect the plumbing together and you subscribe at the end. And if anything at that end gets displayed on the screen, you can hook it to an async pipe instead. And much goodness comes from that. It's a little tougher to learn.
You got to draw the plumbing diagram.
Yeah, right. And to some extent, if what you're doing is not eventually going to land on the screen somewhere, you might not actually need to be doing it, right? Because even if the thing you're doing, let's say you're writing a thing where you press a button that, like, I don't know, activates the blow up the building thing down the street. But even then, you probably want a visual status indicator of whether you successfully made the remote call to trigger the dynamite in the building down the street for your building demolition company. Well, you can hang that indicator off of an async pipe that is tied to a pipeline that's tied to the API call. So I actually think in a huge number of cases, even if you first think, oh, I can't use the async pipe, I have found that like 90% of the time when I first think I can't, I actually can.
Yeah, and that is a huge, like that is the most pushback I get when trying to teach people advanced observables, is they swear that their scenario can't take advantage of an async pipe. And then whenever I demonstrate that it can take advantage of one, they're followed up by, well, that made my process more complex. And whenever I walk them through what all they achieved, and I literally get out the pen and paper. Like, if you want to learn observables and understand this stuff, get out the pen and paper and start drawing your data flow diagrams. And what happens is I draw theirs, and then I draw mine, and I show them how mine is the same, except theirs has leaky buckets taking data from one step to the next, whereas mine's a completely connected pipeline. And that's usually when like things kick in and people are like, oh, okay, I get this now.
Plug our offering here. So if you want Paul to come help go through this process with you, we have an offering for that exact thing.
Yeah. So I don't want to bury the lead for too long here. I'm going to go ahead and share.
Wait, did we get through the top level options?
Well, I just want to have this up for the folks that are kind of already deep into this stuff. I don't want
okay.
to have
Yeah,
to,
let's get that up and we'll use that.
So
hit your share. So share your tab or whatever the mechanism is. By the way, you want to kind of get like a somewhat square aspect ratio of the thing you're sharing. That tends to produce the best result here in StreamYard that we're using.
Do here.
Yeah.
I've not used this tool yet, so
get a window or a tab up and then click the share down there and kind of walk through the process.
Okay, so if I do a Chrome tab.
So while you're bringing that up, I'm going to bring the next word up here on screens. So Lance had written down all the ways. The next way to avoid subscribing, or the next way to get that data, other than a subscriber and async pipe, is the async-await mechanism. If you really are just firing off a one-time like post operation somewhere, you simply make the function you do it in an async function, and then you type await and then toPromise your observable. And that has much better semantics than a manual subscription, because the manual subscription can very easily drop a failure on the floor, which is a very bad thing to do. Whereas an async await will always convert a failure into an exception, where you'll then have TypeScript, JavaScript exception handling to help you along. Paul's share is ready. Let's get this up.
One little bit there that you missed. Often you'll have to put a take one in before the toPromise to make sure that your observable completes.
Yep. Paul, maybe can you narrow that? Will that Make it a little more readable. Yeah, that helped a lot. I think now it'll be readable to people on the stream.
And one other thing about that, I believe it's in RxJS 7. It may be in 8. They are going to deprecate toPromise, and I don't remember what the new thing is going to be.
It's already there.
Okay, yeah, the semantics are slightly different.
Instead of doing a toPromise at the end of the observable chain, you have a similarly named or maybe identically named function that you put around the whole observable, and it's very similar.
Yeah, I don't remember the naming, but there's going to be one version to say, give me whatever the first thing is that is emitted, and another one to give me the last one that's emitted.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and making that explicit will help. It'll avoid having to do that take one thing, which is an annoyance with the await approach. Okay, we have Paul's thing shared. So Paul, is this like going to guide us of how we should do it for different scenarios? This is kind of awesome.
So I just want to touch on this quickly. I don't want to get us off the main thread here, but like for those that are like already deep into thinking about this, you can go ahead and just start looking at this and know that yes, we've already thought through many scenarios here. But yeah, this is just a basic outline of some scenarios that you often find when writing Angular applications, and they kind of describe where the observable is coming from, where the data ultimately needs to land in this data flow process, and my recommendation for how to go about dealing with that data. And as you look through here, like there are a few situations at the bottom where we subscribe. We can get to those. But I just wanted to go ahead and have this up just to kind of let folks know that yeah, we've got many scenarios here that we're very well aware of all different kinds of ways that you might need to use this stuff. And for those that just want to see, hey, well, what about this scenario? Here's the too long didn't read version. You can see it here. You don't have to wait for us to kind of ramble over it. Well, let's take that and go try it out.
Well, let's keep going on our list of ways, and I think we'll be through those pretty soon. It's possible people would actually like if we kind of talk through a whole chart, but yeah, we probably ought to finish saying what the ways are before we go through the flow chart of how to decide. So async-await. We talked about that briefly as being.
I had something to add to async-await.
Yeah, go ahead.
So another thing with async-await is that the promise versus observable abstraction, they are different abstractions, and they have different use cases where the work you're trying to do is actually better modeled by one or the other. So the idea of I have data coming from a backend and a user interaction kind of continuously causes that data to update on my screen. That is a better observables are a better abstraction for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
However, if I have a user who is gathering up some user input and pressing a button to then go actually make a change on the back end, that's actually better represented as a promise.
Yeah.
Because that single transaction of I have data to write is a singular transaction. It is I have data, I want it to write. If it succeeds, great, let me know about it. If it fails, great, let me know about it. It is not intended to be a stream of continuous updates that are going back to a server. That's a different pattern. So the async-await is perfect to break out whenever you have backend calls for the delete, put. I'm forgetting the put.
Post. Delete,
post. Thank you.
Yeah.
For the write path.
Yeah.
On those operations.
Usually a post, put, or delete. Yeah.
But post and delete are the ones where async-await really come in handy because
I think I've given that before. Is that when you're programming a thing which is a get and legitimately semantically is a get, you almost always should be using observables all the way through. When you're doing something that is a data mutation, then you should probably at least consider using an await instead of using observables all the way through.
Yeah.
I also really like that the async-await mechanism is very concise, and it elevates the asynchronicity up to the language level. I think there's going to be some future evolution, maybe of JavaScript ES 2030 or something. At some point, somebody is going to find a way to elevate the observable data flow up into the language level. Because right now, promises are sort of privileged by the language in that they're brought up to the language level, whereas observables are, a verbose library syntax.
Well, to be clear, observables are a tiny, tiny thing. It's the operators that are verbose syntax. There is a difference there, and Ben Lesh is pretty clear about this when he talks about it, that observables are just an interface, and that could really easily go into the language without all of RxJS. They are just separate concepts.
Yeah, but you still want them, right?
You do want them.
If we somehow got the observables in the language, if we got the observable concept in the language, but we still had to do the current kind of one layer up syntax to do anything with them, that wouldn't really solve the problem. The way in which async-await really solves the problem is by deeply integrating the asynchronousness into the language, and that's what I'm not merely hoping to see the observable interface ship with JavaScript. I mean, that would be
you want an observable error to throw an exception.
If I want there to be a syntactic way to make observables fit into the language as if they had been there from the beginning, not as a library, not even as a built-in library. Now, I know I'm asking for a lot, but Svelte does something kind of like this. So, okay. Do we have anything more async-await before we go through our last one? Because I feel like we have a lot to say about Paul's chart. So I don't want to delay too much more getting there. I guess the last modality on our list was to get your data using a route resolver. Now, Paul, I happen to notice we had that thing up. We'll pull it back up. And I saw you mention it on the chart. So can you give us the intro, what it means to use a route resolver for this?
Yeah, so resolve is a specific type of route guard built into the Angular router. And the purpose of it is to delay the loading of a route until you've succeeded in fetching, or until you've succeeded in resolving some sort of asynchronous observable-based call or promise-based call. And the use cases actually aren't as, when you sit down, you actually work through all the scenarios. There's not a lot of ideal use cases for the resolve mechanism. But one place that's really good is if you have a piece of data that you need to fetch in order for a user to utilize a page, and it's kind of important for that page. And if the user's interaction and actions on that page don't result in that data needing to be fetched a second time, if you have those two conditions, a resolve is a really easy way to get that data and use it in a synchronous manner.
Okay.
Yeah, so the API for the resolve mechanism allows you to hand it an observable, and it will deal with the subscription and the unsubscribing of that observable data, and it becomes available to you in a synchronous manner once you've landed in the component that you're trying to route to.
Yeah, so I was trying to remember. So at the point in the router, you just mention your observable under some key, and then at the point of use in the component, you can inject something from the router, and then there's an API to get something, but that get gives you the data that's already arrived. It doesn't give you back the observable, it gives you the result of subscribing. So the subscribe is basically pushed down inside Angular instead of in your application. Go ahead.
And the important aspect here is that observable has to complete in order for it to know that, okay, yes, I'm done, and make that data available. And so it further narrows your use cases down to literally, I just want one piece of data one time, and then once it's available, please navigate me.
So if there was any kind of potential of latency or failure mode, you probably don't want to use that technique.
Unless that failure mode means that it is not appropriate for the user to be able to navigate to that screen. So there is a semantic use there of, oh, it turns out I can't take you to the user reporting page because the user data endpoint is down. That is a suitable kind of use case for the failure on that observable.
So if it takes a moment for that observable to resolve, is there a mechanism to provide some sort of animation or other interstitial screen or display or indication to the user, because they've left one screen, they've left one route, but they can't get to the next one yet for, I don't know, 1 second or whatever? Is there a good user experience you can provide during that time with this approach?
Yeah, the most basic is whatever route you were on previously, have the semantics of a loading screen be accessible from there. So if you were clicking on a user's details, for example,
Okay.
and that was going to navigate you somewhere else, either next to the user you clicked on or a full page spinner that shows up while you're waiting to load the data, that could be displaying while trying to fetch the details that would be displayed on the next screen.
So the user is still looking at the old route while waiting for the resolver to prepare the data for the new route.
With a visual indicator that that work is being done. There are more, you can do crazier, fancier things with the intermediate routes with transitions, but it's definitely not something that you can kind of hand wave through on a call like this.
So are there any other major means to make this bridge from RxJS data to an Angular component? We've covered subscribing and lots of cool stuff about unsubscribing, async pipe, Async-await, which has the same word async, but which is a completely different feature, and route resolvers. Are we overlooking any major ways of doing this?
One thing I want to say is abstracting the problem away. Change your component to be a view component where it gets that value as an input from its parent component, and then the parent component deals with it with one of the other approaches. So overall, we still have to figure out where that's coming from. We still have to use one of those other mechanisms, but for that specific component itself, it's all synchronous data coming in from the inputs. So sometimes that's the easiest way to do it for a specific component, just to extract it out to a view component that doesn't even know that there's anything called RxJS.
So if you're getting a lot of data fetching complexity mixed with visual complexity, that's probably like screaming at you, divide me into 2 layers here so that I'm not dealing with both in the same component. That's a great point. Okay, so I thought of another way to do this, which I have seen done in real apps, and that is just rely on change detection. Have some data sitting in a non-observable variable, have some service just subscribes to the data and then sticks the results in a, for lack of a better word, global variable, even though it's not really a global variable, but it's kind of semantically a global variable, and then just rely on change detection to have the right thing happen. You can do the change detection kind of bucket brigade from the very top if you want to. You could do arbitrary computation. When the result comes in, you could get it shoved into a variable in a component up at the top of your component tree or anywhere in your component tree, and then just rely on change detection to notice that happened. And sort of don't directly trigger the eventual display off the resolution other than via change detection. Now, I think this is generally frowned upon. It's certainly frowned upon by me, but I think it is kind of in keeping with the original vision of Angular, that in many cases you can just sort of not care. Do we have any? I mean, I've seen people do that and have it work okay. What do we think?
That strikes me as something that will not scale well, but for a toy, it'd be fine.
You nailed it. Yep.
Yeah. And I've seen it work in situations where the amount of data and the amount of computation is pretty small. You're just like filling out a form and doing some kind of lookup. It doesn't matter how well it scales because the application is a couple of forms and a couple of lookups, and your computer can do 3 billion operations per second.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so harsh as to say it's only good on a toy, but yeah, the general sentiment of that statement, absolutely. I've actually I lived that world. My very first Angular app was back when Angular was still in the alphas, and it was getting to a pretty serious size and scale, and it was before anyone knew any real strategies for dealing with any of this.
There were no best practices yet.
Right. And my very first app, I did what you described, that bucket brigade.
Yeah.
Which is to say all of my application state lived in app-component.ts, and I built my hierarchy of components underneath that. And if I needed data at a leaf of that visual tree that's created, I had to pass from input to input to input to input to input all the way down until it got there.
Yeah,
and
I wrote that program too at some point.
And after a while, I was like, "This is madness. There's got to be another way."
And this is a story of how we became NGRX users on like 0.003 or whatever the earliest barely
Exactly.
working version of NGRX was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this sounds like an advertisement for Kyle's famous crying baby talk.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, Lance, you can go look up that URL if you want to put it in there.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I kind of wish I'd had a better graphic than a crying baby, but you know, it's still kind of true, right? Like it state management might make you cry.
The funny thing is, I just Googled Kyle Cortis crying baby, and that YouTube link popped up at the top.
There you go.
So,
How convenient is that?
so yeah, YouTube. I don't know how. I didn't do an incognito search, so I don't know if this is true for everyone or just Google knows me well.
So Paul offered this up a few minutes ago. And I think, if I understand this right, Paul, you've actually thought through many specific concrete scenarios where data is coming from an observable. And you've thought through, kind of based on some guidelines, you're probably going to be able to talk to us about, what is the sort of, like, what should your default or good subscription approach be for each of it? Looks like you have at least a dozen scenarios here, and you're not, there's probably more with scrolling. So do you like, is it worth talking through some of these in any more detail? Because this looks really fantastic to me. It's a recipe book, right? You can just follow the recipe book and you'll do the right things.
Yeah. Before we do though, you asked a question about other ways of dealing with this, and there's actually a really big one that that we're not covering here, and that is if you are making extensive, effective use of the best practices of NGRX effects, and you have great action hygiene, you can actually avoid doing a large amount of any kind of subscription. Because when you drop into NGRX effects, what you're essentially doing is you're saying, I'm going to let NGRX actually deal with the subscription to my observable. Now, I still have to form a pipeline that works, but I hand it off to NGRX to deal with that life cycle of subscribing to it, getting the data out, and it turns it into.
Go ahead.
What you do is you return an action from that observable, and the effects machinery will subscribe to that and emit that action on your behalf upon data coming out of that observable. And so you don't ever subscribe to any of the things in your effects.
So don't you still have to deal with one of these things on the other side when data is coming from NGRX to you and your component for display on the screen?
Yes, you still have to take data from the store, which arrives in an observable format, and get it on the screen. But the overwhelming quantity of places where I see folks get sideways with their observable use is when they need to add that interactive bit from a user, or timing a backend call, or calling a refresh on a cycle. If you're doing NGRX correctly, all of those interactions turn into actions that will update your store or trigger an effect. And so you don't have anything any user interactivity or any asynchronous activity that you have to subscribe to. Those all become actions. So you need only take your data from the store, async pipe it onto your template, and you're all set.
And I also recall this, I don't know if it's in the box yet, but at one point I was using an add-on library with NGRX that basically you would select out the data you wanted to use in this component, and then it would trigger change detection when that subset of the data changed. So you could have reasonable efficiency, right? Which is something you lose if you put it off the top and re-change detect the entire app. So you could have both reasonable efficiency, and you didn't have to explicitly subscribe to the data coming out of NGRX. So that there are ways around this. So there's another answer out there. We're trying to stick with what you can readily do within the box. But if we're willing to go deep into NGRX and surrounding libraries, we might have a couple other general solutions. But I think that would be maybe too much scope for us.
Yeah, I felt it was important to point that out because a lot of people do that all day, every day, and successfully avoid these problems. And that is definitely where we start getting into things like Thomas Burleson and Deborah Carrada's content. They cover this very thoroughly when it comes to.
I'm not a big fan of using a large complex library with like circuitous global level state propagation
Right.
for what can be very efficiently, concisely, and locally handled with 3 lines of RxJS.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm really a fan of using those big library solutions only for parts of your state that truly are application spanning, and not getting to where basically every screen of your app has 14 actions associated with it, and so somewhere there's a list of 4,000 actions. I think there are some scale problems with solving every problem using a global state solution.
Yeah, and talking about the trade-offs of when and when not to use that, I think is a conversation we've already even had on this channel.
Yeah, I think we have. So if you're watching for the first time, you need to go back and watch the entire, all of the back episodes from the beginning. And I guess we need to remind people to like and subscribe too, or just to beg suitably for that. So can we go to your amazing chart yet, Paul? I mean, we've been teasing this for about 45 minutes now. We've had people waiting for us to dig in on the meaning here. So what does this chart mean, and like kind of how would talk me through using this as imagine me a fresh young Angular developer, and I want to do the right thing, but I haven't written 17,000 components yet. How do I use this to do the right thing?
Yeah, so just a touch of backstory. So this came about from for a while there we were doing, back when meeting people face to face was still a thing. We were doing Angular meetup, and I did a segment called Angular FAQs, and I put out a call to the internet to kind of say, hey, other Angular instructors and educators, what are some of the most common questions that you get asked, on the, in your classes and through your video series? And there's actually Deborah Carrata was the one who responded saying, like, when to subscribe or how to subscribe. I don't remember exactly how she phrased it, but she called out this particular problem as one that definitely needs a lot of addressing. And so I took it, I ran with it, made this slide to kind of codify what I do when I'm writing Angular apps and how I attack these various scenarios to solve this very problem. And so, yeah, pick a scenario you want to talk about, and we'll kind of talk through how I arrive at my approach here on the right.
How about the second scenario, server-side filtering of a data table? I feel like kind of conceptually, all of our customers have a lot of data. That data doesn't all fit in the browser, but they want a user to be working with controls in the browser, and they want to be doing some reasonably efficient and correct, querying of a back-end system to bring up the right data. I think I just described, 30% of all enterprise application screens.
Yep. Yeah, so in this scenario, you can easily imagine you've got your table in the middle, but there's a series of controls all at the bottom. You've got one that wants to know what page you're on. You've got one that wants to know what key you're filtering on. You've got maybe an input where you type into it to try and filter down, what key you want to sort on, and a user input to help filter. So you've got these 3 separate sources of input. Typically, you want to abstract those, represent that as a form group that has various kinds of data that you can then subscribe to. So as the user is interacting with it, you can represent the user's state for how they would like to view that table as an observable. Now, here it describes it with the combined latest and async pipe. And so I imagine how this is representing it is we have both our set of filters and we have a stream that we need to go on and request for the data. And so I'm going to take my various inputs, and instead of representing them as like a single form group, it would be like if they were separate individual controls. So maybe they're not all possible to be put into the form group. Well, I can take each of those observables that represents another one of the data points from the user, and if I know about the combine latest function within RxJS, I can take all those, bind them together, and have them represented as a single stream. And so I can then take that single stream that represents all of my different user inputs to form this data. And what's missing here is, like, along the way, we'd probably also want a switch map that would say, given this stream of data that represents my inputs, I need to then switch to an HTTP request using that data and then take that resulting observable as my representation. And then finally, at the end of the day, I'm going to capture that and use async pipe on my template. And so with this approach, I don't have anything that I need to do in the middle that can't be represented by a clever use of RxJS functions and operators. Yeah, thanks, Lance. We actually have examples of this in our curriculum, so you can actually see where we do that.
Yeah. Somebody wants to type out a somewhat lengthy URL. No, the URLs are in the YouTube chat. So they're on the screen here just so you know to look in the YouTube chat, but we're not expecting everybody to go and type out a long URL. Yeah, so this is such a common pattern. We actually see it in our training materials.
And
That's
it might
great.
not be exactly everything that Paul described. The order of things happening might not be exactly the same, but it's the same basic idea of using operators and combining together with the results being exposed through async pipe.
Yeah. I would say what's probably more beneficial than well, what's the answer is understanding where people get crossways on trying to do these, trying to implement these kinds of features. For this one, the server-side filtering of data table, the problem, the pit that we see people fall into is they think of their various inputs or their form group as a single entity. And they say, oh, I need to get the data from that before I can do anything useful, rather than seeing it as the first part of their full pipeline. And so no, don't subscribe to your data sources. Take the observable representation that's already there and go ahead and pipe that into your final answer.
So this one is you're talking about basically the high-end proper implementation of the R part of CRUD. And
right.
What we've seen is that there are many application screens that need really good R from CRUD, but there are others that need the full CRUD. So the other one that you put in here that really got my attention is the one that says HTTP post, put, update, and delete with data refresh. Now, I don't know, that might be too much to talk through if we don't have a coded example, but I think doing that, wiring that all up correctly with proper RxJS data flow, I think is widely used and widely needed in our Angular community. Do we teach a full example of that, or is that almost too advanced for our initial class?
We have an example of that in both our RxJS class and our Angular for Architects class.
Okay, because you need
is,
so much background.
There's a lot of Rx needed to fully do that upright.
But if you do, I remember, I think you walked me through this code I don't know, back in the good old days when we were sitting in a development studio together. Soon,
yeah.
And I remember being impressed by the amount of explanation, but then just how concise and powerful the code was that did it. And that once you had it all wired together, it was just really, really crisp.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting how so it is impossible to tell from just this one line here. But what this is referring to is the idea that I might have a data table and I have an entry that lets me add a new row. And I want that data table to be updated with that new data that I've typed into that row after I hit a submit button. At the end of the day, that's actually a surprisingly common pattern, is that I display some data, allow the user to make an update, expect the screen to update to reflect that new data. A lot of folks, they go about this most often by way of trying to simultaneously update both their front end and their back end state. Things get out of sync, things become a mess, it all falls apart. But what this is describing is how to do that successfully, where you're actually reliant upon the call to the back end to dictate whether or not you update the actual local client state. And so the most common way to do that is after you make your backend call to do that update, you then have to requery the data and it should then be reflected there. And the reason why you have to do a full requery is because in the case of a table, the new data entry that you've created may not actually be in view of the data set that you're currently looking at. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's up to the backend rules, both for the creation operation and the read operation, to determine whether or not it should appear in that data set. And so to do this right in most cases, with the exception of like an optimistic preview kind of a version of this, you actually need that full round trip of post the data, requery it to determine if it should be in view. And furthermore, I need to be able to do that as that user continues to modify that input and add new inputs over time. How do I go about doing all that without a subscribe? Well, it is possible, and that's kind of what this is getting at is, if you sit down, you diagram it all out, you find out that at the end of the day, you can get most of the way there with just a couple of switch maps and an async pipe.
Yeah.
Sorry, now, all that background said, what was the original question again, Kyle? Oh,
yeah,
you were commenting on the structure of it. Okay. Yeah, and this was actually inspired from my work with Firebase.
Nice.
Firebase has an absolutely beautiful push-based architecture.
Yeah, it's really
that when
nice.
you combine it with Angular Fire, you basically have an observable that represents your database state.
Yeah.
And so if you want to know what's in your database, you async pipe that onto your template, and as your database changes, your view is just immediately updating with the results of your database.
This is one of those things, when I think about it too much, Paul, I get sad because like there's a dream out there of a full end-to-end data flow where there's like a state of the world in a database, and then there's like a declarative query of some subset of that database flowing through onto your screen, right? And it's all a data flow, both over the wire and locally, so that regardless of whether you or somebody else changes the state of the database, your screen just updates. And that all seems great. But then I realized that practically speaking, many or most systems we see actually have one or more layers of microservices in between the core data store and what's on the screen. And to realize that dream, every layer of the system would have to be written in an abstract query data flow mode. And I haven't really seen any appetite anywhere at writing any of the intermediate layers in this sort of transparent data flow mode. The intermediate layers are almost always written in if you want the current data, you have to ask again sort of mode.
Right.
This might be something for another 10 years in our industry. This might be the big trend, is somehow having layers to build on so that all the layers of your system can just pass novelty through as it happens, instead of some of them being requery only.
Yeah. And so this came about with me wanting to say, how do I recreate that without Firebase? If I just had a normal backend that was not pushed base, how can I recreate that magic of in my components not having to do any kind of wiring of inputs back to outputs, and just have unidirectional data flow all the way to my backend? I make a post, and then the observable that got me the data in the first place automatically updates with any refreshed data, and my component does no wiring whatsoever to put those two pieces together. That was what inspired this idea. And Glenn's asking if I have a diagram. Unfortunately, I did not actually anticipate getting into this, so I do not have one ready to show. But yeah, I will look for that and see if we can't find a way to get that attached to comments later on.
Yeah, in our private chat, Lance pointed me to a tweet where Wes Grimes, a fellow famous Angular person, pointed out that NGRX, as we were discussing, also can often rescue you from having to deal with subscriptions by hand. There are modes of using NGRX where it just delivers you the data and change detection happens, and you don't have to subscribe, which is great. Let me see here. I don't know, Paul. It almost makes me wonder if we should have some future event. I don't know if it'd be in this context or as like a more of a sign up and come to our event, and maybe you could like present the full glory of that pattern with the explanation. I think there's just so much goodness there. It's kind of pretty far down the rabbit hole from where we started of how do we get observable data onto a screen, but I think there's great stuff there.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart though, and it's not. That's why we don't go into it in the basic Angular bootcamp, because it's deep in the RxJS knowledge base.
I would say our Angular bootcamp goes very far and very fast, but we still try to stay within the realm of what someone could plausibly keep up with if it was their first few days of Angular use.
Right.
And I think the level of sophistication we're talking about in some of these patterns you have on here are maybe beyond what a person should be expected to do in their first few days. Now, maybe a month in, if they're working in the right team with the right mentors, a month in, they might be able to dig into some of these patterns, but probably not in the first few days. But what else do we have to cover here?
Yeah, I was going to say, any others before we look at the specific subscription examples?
No, not unless you want to bring up. You have an example to bring up of subscription handling. Go for it.
Well, just some scenarios down here.
Yeah, go ahead.
There are these four at the bottom where I describe a situation where I still subscribe, do good old fashioned .subscribe.
Okay.
And they're not too uncommon really. So this one is capturing a user input and putting it in a URL.
Yeah.
So this is where you have a form control, and what you'd like to be able to do is use that form control to modify a query parameter, for example, in your URL. This actually kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of like, I want to filter a table, but this time I would like to be able to capture that user's query in my browser URL. That way, if they refresh or would like to bookmark the results and come back to the page in that same state, they can.
And in fact, the example server-side filter of data table app that I posted the link to earlier uses this exact feature.
Yeah.
And so here,
I love that example. That is such a great example.
Just shout out to Zachary for working hard on that. And so here I'm going from a form control, which has given me observable, but I've got to put some data into the URL. And so my end target here is not a template.
Right.
It is kind of, in that it is downstream of the URL. I would then make a fetch, but there is a gap where in order to put the data onto the URL, I'd have to have an API that accepts observable data. And we just don't have that today. Angular doesn't give it to us, and there's just nothing natively that knows how to accept an observable. If I would like to change the URL programmatically and specify a query parameter, that's just not a thing today in terms of wanting to accept an observable. And so the only way to go from I have an observable to I make a synchronous call, and that is the termination point of that data flow, then I have to subscribe.
Right, because you can't use an await because you want it to happen repeatedly, not only once, right? You can't use an async pipe because it's not. You said it's not going onto the screen, so you have to, So for anybody who hasn't made it over to that example that we linked earlier in the chat, I think Lance linked earlier in the chat. It has a really surprising design. I've talked with people in classes and our customers have been surprised by this because there's no direct wiring from the input controls to the backend search. The input controls end up adjusting the URL, the query params, and then we separately watch the query params and run the backend search. And it takes a little to get your head around. If you've never seen that before, it seems just incredibly weird to have a screen where you're typing something in and doing a search, but there's no code that says when the user types something in, go do the search.
Yeah, it's even weirder when you're teaching it and haven't looked at it or thought about it in a while. And I apologize to students from several of my classes when I've been in that mode of, wait a minute, why does this happen? Oh, wait, yeah. I always have to review that one before I teach it to say that the focus is everything's going through the URL bar, and just to emphasize how the flow is happening. Because otherwise, if you don't understand it, it's so easy to get lost in that example.
But it's absolutely a correct implementation, right? Like, there's no way to make that better by adding additional wiring between the input fields and the backend call. The only thing you could do by trying to do that is to make it worse. Okay. Well, Paul, any others here you want to go over? We're at an hour and 20 minutes, so we will wrap up after we've gone through, I guess, as much as we want to go through.
Yeah, I would just say like that pretty well captures that example I just gave. You can actually make that a generic statement where when what you want to do is, given some observable data, you need to call some sort of API that is not observable aware. Like, that's when you run into these edge cases where a subscription is needed. So in all of these here, this next one was, I have a URL and I would like to use the value that is in that URL to set a value in a form control. Well, set value doesn't know how to take an observable, and so that breaks our ability to use an observable chain any further. I have to subscribe, put it in the form control.
I had to do this once, and I used actually what Lance suggested earlier. I made a component that I put my D3 diagram in, and I had its code, update code, in an ng on changes, and then I async piped in the parent component, and that way my component that was encapsulating just my D3 diagram didn't need to care about observability. It was sort of readily testable, developable just by setting a property, and that worked pretty well. But that only works in a case where you can like carve out that one piece and make it a separate component. If it's kind of inevitably tangled with other wiring, then you'd have to do a manual subscribe.
Or if you're deep in the middle of service code.
Well, hopefully you're not calling D3 APIs in the middle of service code, right?
There's plenty of there. Well, D3 also had D3 is more physics engine than it is rendering engine.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe you are calling it somewhere down there.
Yeah. I use D3 because that was kind of the thing I was busy working with when I made this. But yeah, I would agree that the general idea though is that even in many of these cases, you can rearrange your component hierarchy a little bit and then use a smart view component pattern to abstract away the hairy thing that needs to consume the data, abstract that away from the observable data source, and with an async pipe bound to an input, you can once again avoid your subscription. I would say in the cases of like the things down here, I would not introduce a smart view component pattern for the sake of solving this problem.
Yeah.
But if you can utilize one for many reasons or additional reasons, look to take advantage of it in these situations as well.
Well, should we wrap that for today? We had another topic to talk about, but we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm kind of tired. So,
yeah, I think we covered this pretty well.
I'm trying to think if there's anything we want to end with. So if somebody really wanted more of what we have to say in a more formal setting, like, do any of our offerings go into this stuff in depth? Like, does Angular for Architects do much with this?
Angular for Architects will do a good job of talking about how some of these patterns have architectural data flow implications.
Okay, but it's like up a level.
It's up a level, and we don't get into, and here's the exact combination of operators you need to achieve it. That's not what you're going to hear in Angular for Architects, but it's showing you how these ideas match up to have an effect on your architecture of your data flow and component hierarchy.
How about our RxJS or NGRX classes? Do either of those help with some of this stuff?
The NGRX class does not go into this level of detail because it's focusing on the NGRX libraries.
Right.
So I don't know about the RxJS class. I haven't looked at that content in a while.
We have a question from a viewer if that table is shareable. I don't know if it's shareable, but there's nothing we could do to stop you from screenshotting the video.
Yeah, the
Paul, is that
table is
published
actually
somewhere, or is that in something internal of yours?
it's in a weird state. You can get to it, nothing proprietary or anything like that. It wasn't built to be a shared thing, so it's not easy to get to.
Right.
But you can get to it through GitHub or through StackBlitz. I actually just put a link into chat. Did that get filtered out? There we go. Kyle just put that on the screen. You can actually get to it through StackBlitz, and that will drop you right into this table.
So yes, to answer
yes.
Stephen Lee's question, yes, there is a way to get to this. Great.
If it doesn't work, you can always go to my GitHub repo, DPS3.
Or they could tweet you.
That, or you can tweet me.
Your Twitter is right on the screen here.
We can get it to you somehow if you want it bad enough.
Yeah.
And I'll work on making it more accessible.
Great.
Yeah, I clicked on the StackBlitz link and it's not resolving. I don't know if it's having a hiccup, if the link is bad somehow.
Yeah, let me...
Yeah, who knows? Well, we should probably wrap it up unless there's anything else we want to go before we call it for this 2-week period. So I guess we'll see. Some of us will see some of our viewers in 2 weeks. Make sure you click the subscribe button and get on our mailing list and so on, so you don't miss it. We tend to announce the topic just a day or two, the same day or the day before. Ideally, we would announce the topics 3 weeks before and promote them well, but it may be some time before we reach that level of, I guess, organizational maturity to pre-announce our topics weeks ahead. But in the meantime, I guess follow us closely if you're interested in this kind of thing, and tune in. Okay, well, I guess goodbye, everybody. We'll wrap it up.
Thanks, folks.